Before we get started, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we record this podcast, the Wurundjeri People of the Kulin Nation. We pay our respect to elders past and present. Hi and welcome to Boldly Me. I'm Chloe Hayden and I'm an actor, author, disability activist and motivational speaker. In this podcast, I'll be chatting to people who are living boldly and are unapologetically themselves. Today, I'm joined by Clementine Ford. Clem is a feminist commentator, writer, speaker, and host of the Dear Clementine podcast. She's written 3 different books, and she's currently working on her 4th title called I Don't, The Case Against Marriage. Clem, thank you so much for joining me in the studio today.
Oh, it's such a pleasure to be here. I'm so excited for your podcast.
Oh, thank you so much. I'm so excited for you to be here. Okay, so the first question that I ask all of my guests is what they are hyperfixating on at the moment.
I am writing a book at the moment about marriage and about the history of marriage. And I've been reading a lot of books, feminist scholars, history books, anthropologists, and I'm deep in the history of it all, which is fascinating to me and probably quite annoying for all of the people that I go out to dinner with who have to hear me saying things. And then in the Middle Ages, when they wrote The Hammer of Witches, this is what happened. But I think that one of the things that's great about hyperfixations, and again, I know you talk about neurodivergence being a superpower. One of the things that I really appreciate about being neurodivergent in the way that I am is that I think that we need people to be enthusiastic rememberers of history and reminders of history.
That's such a cool way of putting that.
Yeah, well, I thank you. I appreciate that because not everyone feels the same way. What I've been learning about like fixating on the history in the way that I am and amassing the knowledge and the information is not only that we have been really sort of broadly kept from it as women in the world, but also that people confidently offer, not even just arguments, but they confidently offer blanket statements as fact for things that not only do they not know the history about, obviously, but they don't even seem to be interested in like doing the basic level of research to support.
Yeah. Wow. I loved listening to you hyperfixate about that.
Oh, it's a good thing you stopped me because I could have just kept going.
No, that was brilliant. I think I know you're neurodivergent. What brand of neurospicy, if you don't mind, if you're comfortable?
I don't mind at all. I have ADHD and I have OCD, which is a lesser known component of the neurodivergent family. It's actually one that I would say I find a lot of powerful things in having ADHD and a lot of things that I've been able to use to my advantage and a lot of things I really love about it. The things that I don't like about having ADHD are so superficial and I would never give it up to just be better with time, for example. But I have to say that OCD is a very different kettle of fish.
Right, yeah.
And there's not a lot to it that I find particularly positive. And that's probably a familiar experience to a lot of people listening who may have OCD, but I don't want to speak for them. But yeah, it's way less able to be harnessed for anything. I mean, I would give it up in a second.
Right. I'm autistic, have ADHD. I don't have much experience in OCD. For both myself and for those that are listening, could you kind of show us a little bit of your mind about how both ADHD and OCD present themselves for you?
Well, I'm one of the cohort of women entering middle age who have only recently been diagnosed with ADHD. So I was diagnosed last year when I was, I was about to turn 41 and I was diagnosed. Funnily enough, around 10 years ago, a friend of mine who, when she was diagnosed, said, I think you've got this. But I, of course, was like, I don't have that. Don't be ridiculous. Which, I mean, it's so, again, like looking at history, I think that it's really important for people to remember that, and particularly for young people, and I say this with the spirit of a mother who's like, I am in my middle years and I can offer you some of my experience. And I don't mean it at all to be condescending. But even though we've got so much further to go in terms of like progressive understanding and inclusivity, we are so much further than we were 10 years ago.
100%.
And that's something that we can actually take a lot of heart in, is that in a short period of time, yes, things still suck in lots of ways, but in a short period of time, they suck a lot less in terms of how we have the conversations.
Yes.
So 10 years ago when my friend said to me, I think that you've got ADHD. I was like, don't be ridiculous. I don't have that. Subtext being, because that's something that people who don't have their shit together have.
And it's a kid on red cordial and the stereotypes.
And I'm going to say what we were kind of raised to believe when we were kids, it's the naughty boy disease. And I use the word disease intentionally.
No, 100%. And it's, parents can't control their kids and it's,
Yeah. So and also like at the time I didn't even consider what it meant to say to her, don't be ridiculous. I can't have what you have.
Oh, so she was ADHD.
She had been diagnosed with ADHD.
Wow. Okay.
And she said to me, I think you have this too. And I have to say that in saying that to her, don't be ridiculous, I didn't even think of the subtext of what it meant and I didn't think, it's so funny that you like think of the implications of it too, that when she was telling me that, I didn't think, I definitely didn't think you don't have it. I accepted freely and there was no sort of, she said she hadn't. I was like, okay, cool, you've got it. But I didn't think, wow, that makes you less than. And yet somehow in my brain, when she said, I think you've got it, there was still that stigma of me going, no, I can't have that.
Yeah, of course. But the thing is, we've been societally conditioned to believe that, especially as women, especially with our entire medical field is inherently misogynistic, ableist, classist, racist. So when we as women particularly, and I'm incredibly privileged to have been given both my autism and my ADHD diagnosis before the ages of 23, but as a middle-aged woman, and you receive that diagnosis, it's the reason why it scares us is because it's like we have been conditioned and told our entire lives that this isn't something that we can have.
Mm-hmm. Well, and that for a long time, we just didn't even think that ADHD was something that women could have at all.
Yeah.
Same with autism,
know. Yeah.
But obviously the way that you learn to mask as a girl is so different as well because things like hyperfixations are just seen to be things that perfectionist girls do, And I think as well, probably when she told me that, part of my sensitivity to it was this sense of like, if you spend 40 years of your life with undiagnosed ADHD, one of the things that you are super conscious of all the time is people thinking that you're a f***up. And people thinking that you're lazy,
yes.
And people thinking that you're selfish and that you're just really disorganized. Mm-hmm. And so when someone is standing there and saying, even when they're saying it with the best of intentions and from their own experience,
you're immediately going to take those negative connotations.
Well, just to yourself, it's like you just experience it, I think, once again as like, oh, God, I'm a useless and people can tell. I haven't been able to cover it up.
Oh, my God, yes.
And obviously, like, again, disclaimer, it should be very clear that when I say that, I'm reiterating stereotypes.
Yeah.
I don't think that. And I definitely don't think that anymore. So when I sort of started exploring diagnosis, it sort of happened in the same way that it's beginning to happen for a lot of women, which is that my friend went through a diagnosis. Different friend, obviously 10 years after that initial one. And she was going through a diagnosis because she was getting a child diagnosed, which again is how a lot of middle-aged women are realising it's in themselves because their children are going through the process.
Class.
And it's made me realise a lot about my mother passed away when I was 26. So there's lots of stuff there now that is making a lot of sense.
Yeah.
But when my friend was telling me about it, and I was like, whoa. I think I've got that.
Yeah, ticking all the boxes.
Yeah, and so I went through the laborious process, as everyone knows. And I went through it with, as you said, an enormous amount of privilege. Like I had access to, I think it's just a statement of fact that if you have somewhat of a prominent persona, you can bypass things. It doesn't mean that you can see someone tomorrow, but you can probably get someone to help you see someone
100%.
earlier.
But the other thing as well, and I acknowledge that in Australia we do have a much better healthcare system than most other countries, but it is still a years-long waiting list if you're going through the public system and thousands of dollars if you do choose to get it quicker. So unless you are from a higher class and from a higher socioeconomic class, it is really difficult to get.
And the thing is, I can afford it at 41, but I wouldn't have been able to afford it at 22.
Yeah.
And probably not even at 32 would I have been able to justify the expense. And I say justify the expense, and that's also because women, apart from not having access to as much money, but we are also conditioned to think, well, my health is secondary. You know, the amount of separate issue, but the amount of mums I know who are like, well, we can't justify the expense on, you know, fixing my pelvic floor. And it's like, but does he have a PlayStation? Anyway, separate topic. I can see myself going down the hyperfixation route.
No, we love it.
So I went through I got an appointment with a psychiatrist. I had obviously the referral from my GP, went through the psychiatrist appointment, and it's not like, I mean, it's so funny when people say things like, well, it's just a fad now. It's just a trend. It's like,
oh my God.
Shop and
the neurodivergent epidemic. Like,
yeah.
Oh my God, shut up.
I mean, it's really hard to see a psychiatrist, and it's also really hard to like fake your way to an ADHD diagnosis. Anyway, I got the diagnosis and I was like, this fills in a lot of blanks for me. And I went and I told my family, and I said, hey fam, some news. And my family is full of like weird and wonderful geniuses. And we've all, like my cousins call it the CFCF. And it's the Convention of the Ford Control Freaks. So there's always been an acknowledgement of like weird and wonderful geniuses. And I said I've got ADHD, and, you know, then members of my family started saying, yep, oh, that's, you know, welcome. I was diagnosed with it at this age. And then I know I've got other family members who are going through the diagnosis process now. And then there's other different kind of strains of neurodivergence. And it's a little bit, there's a part of me that just thinks, well, it's so funny that none of us ever talked about this. But also it made me feel really validated.
Yeah.
Because so much of the process, particularly as a woman, particularly when you're dealing with really gross kind of judgments from people, oh, it's just a trend now, is not only do you feel once again like someone is accusing you of lying, which is a huge thing, obviously, when you're neurodivergent, that you are always worried that people think that you're lying about everything, even though I find it I can tell a lot of like fibs to cover up my time blindness, but I find it really hard to lie about stuff that matters.
Of course.
Like I wouldn't just lie about having a diagnosed something. I just couldn't do that. Anyway, so you sort of feel like you're always lying. And so to be met with total support and validation and simpatico from my family members saying, yep, I've got it too. I was like, I don't know. I mean, I'm sure you know what it feels like, and anyone who's got this same experience, but it's so important to validate people when they say
such a relief. And I guess especially like you were saying yourself, there was a time of your life where you were kind of gaslighting yourself in a way. We're kind of invalidating your own potential of being neurodivergent. So the fact that you were able to, I guess, counteract that with a family that was supportive is massive, because then you can go, okay, well, I can actually change my mindset and I can actually change what I'm feeling because I'm actually seeing the results right here, right now in front of me.
Well, I was actually really worried about telling my dad in particular because, you know, we just have lots of different views on lots of things. And I wasn't, unfairly, I think, I expected a response from him that was not the response that I got.
Yeah.
And the response I actually got was, that's great news. I'm glad that you've got that answer. I always knew that there was something different about you. And I wrote back and I said, different good or different, what do you mean? And he said, different good, you know. And I thought that was, you know, there's lots of stuff that I disagree with on things with my dad. But that was such a perfect way to respond to it, you know, to provide the validation, yes, and also to say I always knew that there was something different about you, different good. And you are different, but you're also unique and have like a magical way of thinking, and no two neurodivergent people are exactly the same. I guess no two neurotypical people are the same either, but you know, I'm left-handed as well, and left-handedness is obviously not neurodivergence, but there was a time in history where left-handed people were forced to write.
Did you ever go to Sovereign Hill as a kid?
I didn't.
So I'm left-handed as well, and I think there needs to be a study done into how many neurodivergent people are left-handed. But I remember we did like a role play school, and they like sit me outside because they were like, "You're left-handed, so like we would have burned you at the stake," and I was like, "Oh."
Your mother's probably a witch.
Yeah, I'm like, period, slay.
I'm not going to write letters about it or anything. I'm not going to make it my big platform. But it does kind of annoy me when people are like, I'm just a bit OCD about that stuff because...
when people are using actual diagnoses as like adverbs.
Yeah, and I think maybe my sensitivity with the OCD thing is way more than the ADHD thing because there's part of me that thinks, yeah, well, of course you want to have ADHD because it's super cool. Because I really love it, and I really love like the way that it benefits my life and my creativity. And not everyone I know has that experience. Not everyone has been able to parlay it into like a field where it can be maximized rather than...
Yes, and again, another massive privilege. I've always said autism and ADHD are my superpower, and I've copped a lot of flack for saying so because a lot of people don't see it that way. And again, I think it's really important to highlight the fact that I do have the privilege that I'm in fields of work and a place in my life where I can use this as a superpower. If I was in a less privileged position and I had to work a job that I didn't like, I had to work a 9 to 5, I didn't have the support network in my life, it wouldn't be a superpower. Sure. It would be horrendous. It would be really sucky. And that, yes, there are still times in my life where ADHD and being autistic is the pits and it sucks and there's a lot of things that are really shit about it. But the superpowers come because I'm in a privileged place that I can utilize those superpowers.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think it's really important that even though there is privilege involved in that, I think it's important for people to see success as well. Like, yes. I'm sure you followed the Emma Schiano and Michelle Laurie thing a little while ago. And I feel like for Emma Schiano to be an autistic woman with ADHD who has like a big media platform and has created a successful life for herself using her skills. And
because of being neurodivergent.
And of course none of us get to see the intricacies or what she may perceive to be the downsides of it or the more difficult things. But, I thought it was really f***ed up actually that one of these things where she was saying like it's great that Marvel Stadium is providing, and I know that you've had your own issues with that, Chloe, but sort of just on the surface for her to say...
No, of course. The fact that a woman spoke out about... The fact that she was excited to have, and that like there was no negativity in what she said. All she was doing was, how cool is it that I live in a world now where my access needs are supported? And people are ripping into that.
So just to backtrack for anyone who's not across that story, in brief, Emma Schiano, who is, media personality with autism and ADHD, both of which were diagnosed in the last couple of years. She did a post about Marvel Stadium's Harry Styles concert because Marvel Stadium were providing sensory rooms for people who had access needs. And Michelle Laurie, who is also a popular true crime podcaster, responded very negatively to this post by saying autism isn't concerts, and I'm paraphrasing, so I'm not directly quoting, but the essential gist was autism isn't concerts and this is privileged and... and she kept talking about being the mother of an autistic child, which is its own separate thing of, an invasion of privacy. And exactly. And saying, my life is really hard and it's not about concerts and blah, 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 blah. And so there was this kind of big fallout of that. And I remember looking at it and thinking, well, firstly, your experience, maybe you're undiagnosed, I'm not sure. Either way, if you're using your autistic child as a justification for your attack on this autistic woman, that's not your argument to make. But also, Emma Schiano is an autistic woman who is using her platform to create changes that will benefit your child, is what you're saying. If you're saying autism isn't going to concerts, why is it not going to concerts?
Yeah, and you know what? Because like you said, I had issues with the same, unfortunately for the opposite reasons. But when I was speaking about my experience at Marvel Stadium, the amount of comments that people were posting about me on social media being like, autistic people shouldn't even be attending things like this anyway. And I'm like...
A real autistic person?
Yeah, literally.
No true Scotsman.
Dude, literally. It's like a real autistic person would be holed up in their bedroom like, oh, you must be faking it because if you were actually autistic, you wouldn't be here in the first place. Huh?
I'm just really sorry that happened to you.
Oh,
it must have really sucked.
But you know what? And like and maybe this is me being too optimistic, but I've always kind of had a bit of a everything happens for a reason sort of thing mentality, and I've there's a lot of chapters in my life that I would rip out in a heartbeat if I could, but I can't do that. So now I've got the understanding of, well, I can't change what has happened to me or I can't change what I've been through. So how can I use this to ensure that no one else has to go through this again? And what can I do to ensure that we can use this as a learning tool?
There's a beautiful quote which is about like political activism and change, and it's we're planting seeds for a forest we may never get to sit in.
Wow.
And I think that's a really beautiful way of looking at any kind of social change, but also knowing that neurodivergent people in particular, sounds like a humble brag, but whatever, like neurodivergent people have a very keen sense of justice and a very like yes and no sense of right and wrong.
Black and white, and this is what it's supposed to be. And
even when I was little, like one of the things that made a lot of sense to me after my diagnosis was that I had such a strong sense of injustice when I was little. You know, no, that's wrong.
Yeah.
That's wrong.
I got in trouble at school
fair.
Every day.
Yeah, I used to get in trouble a lot with my dad. So
Yeah, me too.
And I think that when you think of yourself as part of a tradition of people, justice warriors or whatever, social justice warriors, which is so weird that used to be used as a, I don't even know if people say social justice warrior anymore, but for a time that was like
I think the official new term is snowflakes.
Snowflakes and woke.
Yes, the woke.
Anyway, it used to be social justice warrior, which is just, and then before that it was beatnik, and it was, which is just a really good example of how it doesn't matter what the word is and it doesn't matter what the period of history is. The dominant system will always come up with a negative term to describe people who are trying to change it.
Yeah.
And once you realize that you are part of that incredible history of people who are making the forest more possible, even if they'll never get to see it. So it really is like a selfless act. Then I think it connects you to a sense of justice that is bigger than yourself, that is bigger than the future even, but that ties us right back to the past and helps us to understand how we got where we are today.
You're one of those people that are planting those seeds and ensuring that forest is there for other generations to walk through. First of all, the mental turmoil that is, because I know that you speak a lot about a lot of really, really important topics that unfortunately are still quite taboo. How do you look after yourself, and how do you look after yourself when there's backlash, or basically how do you stay true to yourself with all of that?
Well, I mean, firstly, I have to say that, and I know that you're not repeating this for yourself, but it is true that like it is still considered taboo or too much or like too aggressive to talk about women's rights.
Yeah,
It's just so bizarre to me. Like, wow, it shouldn't be considered aggressive to talk about the fact that women are still disproportionately murdered by men. I think that that's again one of the things that having having ADHD and being neurodivergent really helps with, is that when you have a very keen sense of justice,
nothing's going to stop you from ensuring that justice is had.
Nothing's going to stop you from pursuing it. And also when you come up against people who are like, shut up, or you're ugly, or whatever it is that they think will, go to enjoy your
Isn't that funny that they always go back to your appearance? And I've always found if someone starts insulting my appearance, I'm like, I've won. Because there's nothing else for you to go at.
Exactly. It's also, I started publicly writing when I was 26 years old.
Yeah.
And when I was 26 years old, someone left a comment on an article that I wrote about abortion saying, and it was quite like transgressive at the time, because I wrote an article where I was like, I've had 2 abortions and I'm not ashamed of them. I'm really glad that I was able to get them, and I feel grateful for being able to have my life. But someone left a comment on that saying, I'm surprised you managed to get pregnant once, let alone twice. You're uglier than a dead dog on the side of the road, which I actually think is hilarious. Not because dead dogs are funny, they're not at all. But that is such a specific
It's honestly,
insult.
In their defense, that's quite creative.
It's very creative, and it's also like I can just imagine them sitting there and going,
this is going to get her. She's going to cry herself to sleep.
On the side of the road. Whereas I read it and I was like, so there were a few things that were happening then. Firstly, I was 26, so I was already, like, I notice now the difference between me and 26 and 41 is not that my politics have tempered. I'm definitely still as, like, hungry for change as I ever was. But I think I'm smarter in how I research, in the knowledge that I have. I've just accumulated an extra 15 years worth of knowledge. So that just automatically, in my case, I think makes me smarter. But also when I was 26, I was like, I'm going to go out there, I'm going to ruffle some feathers. So I was achieving exactly what I wanted. And it made me feel really like, yeah, I'm like whipping things up here in this tiny little town, because I was writing in Adelaide at the time. And so I was sort of like spurred on by this reaction to me, but also combined with that really, really keen sense of social justice, that I was like, bring it on. Like, if all you can do is tell me that I'm uglier than a dead dog on the side of the road, like, that's maybe one of the worst things. And I didn't even really feel it to be like bad. That's one of the worst things that anyone is ever going to say to me. And I'm fine.
You are such an incredibly bold person. Before we get on, thank you very much. Before we get on to our last little Boldly Me 3, what inspired your boldness? Why is Clem bold? And how is Clem bold?
I mean, I don't know. What inspired yours? Don't you just feel like it's a part of you?
I think so. I think, first of all, similarly to you, I had an incredible support network that inspired and encouraged my boldness. And I knew that, you know, like, I would go to school and I was selectively verbal until I was 16 because I'd been taught that my voice wasn't important. But when I was home and when I was with my people that loved me and validated me, I wouldn't shut up. I would speak for hours about sharks and dolphins and whatever fun fact I'd learned that day. And they were like, tell me more. So I was able to be bold within my people. So I think, number one, having a really supportive network that encouraged my boldness was instrumental and so important. If you're a parent, if you're a grown-up of a child listening to this, encourage your children's boldness and quirkiness and difference, because it will change and infiltrate their entire lives. I think that was the biggest thing. And I think as well, I had to be bold in order to survive. If I wasn't bold, I wouldn't have survived in this world. So I think they were kind of my two biggest things.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I don't think I necessarily had the parental encouragement that you had, which isn't to say that I was discouraged. I was kind of largely left alone as a child. Yes, a little bit of like maybe too much absent parenting. I'm the youngest of 3 children, and we moved around a lot. Like, I grew up in the Middle East. We lived in England.
Wow.
I went to boarding school for 2 years when I was 7 years old, like halfway across the world. So I feel like maybe in my case, there was a lot of like really, really early learned self-sufficiency.
Yeah, right.
And I think when you learn to be self-sufficient and you spend a lot of time in your head and you don't necessarily have people around you who are encouraging all of your like beautiful quirks and your weirdness, and I say weirdness in the most fond way possible.
Positive, yeah.
But you also don't have people around who are observing you and saying, stop that, write with your right hand. You know, stop talking about that, you're boring, or shut up, or why are you being so annoying, or all that kind of thing, whatever. You sort of like, I don't know, you don't get the encouragement to be that particular way, but you also don't get the sense that the way that you are is necessarily bad or necessarily something you need to like get rid of. It's just that you have to temper who you show it around.
Yeah. So I wrap up every single one of my episodes with the Boldly Me 3, which is 3 questions about you. And I ask the same questions to every guest. So the first question is, what is one song that never fails to make you feel happy?
Oh my God, so many. But the one that immediately jumps into my head is Lovely Day by Bill Withers.
Oh, wonderful. Brilliant.
But also anything Taylor Swift.
Slay. Slay. Number 2 is, what is one piece of advice that you would give to your 13-year-old self?
God, I think I've written like whole shows about this. So how do I summarize it? Okay, 13-year-old self. You have no idea what's coming for you. So even on the days when it feels like life will never begin, there will come a day where everything that you're working towards right now will reveal itself to be worthwhile. And that means that all of the things that make you feel unloved and out of kilter with the rest of the people, and also in lots of ways not like who you're meant to be, are actually there for a precise purpose. And that is because you're on the way to becoming exactly who you are. And you're going to love it when you get there.
I love that. That's really cool. Number 3 is, if you could be any Disney character, who would you be?
That is so good. I love... I watched a lot of Disney with my son during lockdown. Mm-hmm. I really loved Encanto.
Yes.
I love Mirabelle. Yeah, I'd probably choose Mirabelle.
I love that answer.
Because she's so... I mean, in many ways, she represents what we're talking about, which is finding your secret hidden gift that isn't like flashy like the rest. And also that people think there's something wrong with you because you don't have all of these other things that people are meant to have.
Mm-hmm. In the wise words of Mirabelle, the miracle is you.
Yeah, the miracle is you. So I'd say Mirabelle.
I love that. I think that's a brilliant answer. Clem, thank you so much for coming on my podcast today. It was an absolute honour having you hyperfixate to me.
Oh, thank you. It was so nice to talk to you. It's like really nice to not have to sort of apologise for little weird quirks.
Never apologise. Never apologise for your weird quirks.
I'm really appreciative that you're out there providing, you know, such beautiful role modelling to other people and pushing down those barriers and taking the scratches so that people behind you won't have to take quite as many.
Thank you very much. One of my favourite aspects of humanity is seeing neurodivergent women hyperfixate on the topics that they love and that is important to them. And something that is a very, very common trait within ADHD, neurodivergent autistic women, is a lot of us, our special interests, our hyperfixations, the things that are important to us, usually do revolve around social justice and politics. And I think Clem is such a, not just a perfect example, but such a beautiful example of that. Neurodivergent women are my absolute favourite subspecies. It was so nice to have Clem in the studio. Make sure you guys go and check her out. Check out her books, check out her podcast, Dear Clementine, wherever you get your podcasts. If you like what you heard, make sure to rate and review the show on your podcast app if it lets you, and let a friend know. Most importantly, be kind to yourself, be kind to others, and do whatever makes you feel happy. Bye!